Welcome to the Evolved Caveman podcast. I am Dr. John, the guide for your heroic journey towards greater health, success, and most importantly, happiness. And now, on with the show. Hi, this is Dr. John, and I am thrilled to announce that Jory and I are opening up our retreat in beautiful Costa Rica from September 28th of 2024 to October 5th. Everyone wants fulfilling relationships. The hard part is love is not enough. So many factors can get in the way, preventing ongoing connection, intimacy, and aligned growth. All healthy relationships start within. But when we have unresolved stuff, it can easily interfere with those we are seeking to be closest with. Whether you're in a long-term committed partnership or are single and are looking for love, this retreat will guide you in the heroic journey of healing yourself so that you can be open and available to cultivate the fulfilling relationships you desire and deserve. To find out more, visit joryrose.com/retreats. That's JOREEROSE.com/retreats. Hey, everybody, this is Dr. John back with the latest episode of The Evolved Caveman. And today I'm excited to have with me Stephanie James. And I've been on Stephanie's podcast, Igniting the Spark with Stephanie James. And now she's on my podcast. And we've got a bunch of stuff to talk about, but let me give you her bio real quick. Stephanie is a seasoned psychotherapist and transformation coach, a dynamic public speaker, a published author, and filmmaker. And she delivers her message in a powerful way to help others find their own internal sparks, break through limiting beliefs, and create an empowered life full of passion and possibility. Her new film, When Sparks Ignite, hosts a highly reputable cast of international thought leaders and changemakers. Its powerful message is about how the challenges we face can actually become the match point that ignites something within us that becomes our gift to the world. And her latest book, Becoming Fierce, takes the reader through a compelling and dynamic journey to expand personal power, purge what doesn't serve, and design an authentic life that is deeply fulfilling. Stephanie has an unrelenting commitment and personal mission to bring as much love and healing to the world as possible, and her message is clear. Your healing matters. Stephanie, welcome. Good to see you again.
Really good to see you, John. Thanks for having me on the show.
So my pleasure. And so before we started recording, we started talking about, we'd had some real difficulty scheduling this interview. And it was interesting because I was commenting that I've never had to reschedule an interview because of, well, we've rescheduled it twice because of a death in my family and a death in your family. And, my son passed away 2.5 months ago. Your father died a little over a year ago. And you were struggling a little bit on his anniversary, the anniversary of his death. Can you speak to that a little bit? And let's talk about, how do therapists handle grief?
Yeah. So really interestingly, I hadn't spoken to my father in 6 years. I think that's probably one of the important pieces to note in this. And even though I hadn't, I absolutely felt clear and clean, and that I had left our relationship in a really good place, where I had done my work. I had really written him a letter that said, thank you for all these things you've done for me. And because of a lot of dynamics, when you read my book, Becoming Fierce, that's one of the first things it talks about, is the effect of the role my father played through my life. Regardless, the last line of that letter to he and my stepmother were, I love you both dearly, and please don't contact me again. So I had been through for years, even in relationship with him, John, the grief journey. I didn't really have him as the incredible father he was in my life from 13 years old on.
Wow.
So we had this very interesting dynamic relationship. Also, he was a psychotherapist, a psychologist in Austin.
Wow.
Yeah, he and my mother both. So I always say my father was my greatest love and the greatest wound in my life. So it's interesting. My husband says, "Oh, how beautiful that you could be so naive." That I thought, I've really dealt with our relationship. I really feel clear and clean. For 6 years, I had great memories of my father. I can speak so positively And even through those years when things were hard, I had beautiful conversations with him. And he's such a wise man. I learned a lot from him, my whole life. So he said, if you didn't know you didn't, have a relationship with your dad, you'd think everything was great because you speak so highly of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, John, I share all
paradox.
that. Yeah. I felt
so
very
thank you for the
resolved.
context, because that's important.
Yeah, it is. Because when he had this last stroke a year ago, in December, I thought, you know what, I'm okay with this. I'm really at peace. And then I am telling you, for 12 nights, right before he died and right afterwards, I dreamt of him every night. He was in my dreams every night. And I felt gutted. The grief that came in was so huge. And there was a whole nother level.
Passed.
This was before he passed.
Okay.
And then afterwards, it was, I know, my husband, who's really, he's, as you know, a chiropractor and a high performance coach, but he's also this shamanic practitioner and really spiritual dude. And he says to me, it's going to be interesting to see how your relationship is with your dad now.
Uh-huh.
And so it has taken on an interesting turn, but wow, was I unprepared for that gutting, that there was still this very deep level of grieving that needed to happen.
So what happened at the year anniversary?
So this is interesting because I
haven't gotten to the year anniversary part. So I'm like, oh shit, what do I have to look forward to?
Yeah. Well, again, it's interesting. So a week before, the anniversary date was December 6th. And again, I start having these dreams where my father's showing up, and they're not even necessarily really meaningful dreams. Sometimes he would show up and we'd just play cribbage together, which was something he had taught me as a young girl. And we just have conversations, or he'd just pop up as a cameo for a few moments. But it was really interesting because it was really present in my, and he was really present in my consciousness. Yeah. And honestly, John, that week before his anniversary, I truly, truly missed him. I just missed him. And I really looked for, as I always have, what were the golden threads of our relationship, even through, what had happened as I grew up. And just to provide one more note of context for this, I was 100% a daddy's girl growing up, and so the first 13 years of my life, I was literally my father's little shadow. So it was
that has a sting to it for sure.
Yeah. So if he was out, gathering leaves, I was there holding the bag. If he was, this is true for years and years as a little girl. When he would shave in the morning, I would sit on his little counter and he'd put shaving cream all over my face. And I used to shave it with his little plastic toothbrush holder, but it had a little edge to it. So, I just wanted to be near him. And he taught me how to fish at 4 years old. I was his little hiking buddy. It was just, we really had, I had this golden, beautiful childhood that in one night was completely shattered and irreversibly broken at 13 when I woke up to the sound of screeching tires going out of the driveway. And my mom was trying to get out of the driveway and my dad's jumping on the car and pounding on the windshield. And he had just told my mother he was in love with another woman and that he'd been having an affair for the last year. And so this whole beautiful childhood, it was completely shattered. And very shortly after that, I had a stepmother who made it very clear, even though I loved and adored her, that she considered me the other woman. And so I was no longer, from that point on, allowed to speak to my father alone, to spend time with him alone. And until the day he died, I was not allowed to speak to him on the phone without her being present.
Wow.
So, I think had I grown up, John, not having a close father, those first 13 years, I would have been like, okay, this is how it is. But to go from that level of connection and closeness to feeling like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And really some insult to injury when they moved to Austin from Fort Collins, where I lived when I was 16, and I chose to stay here because I'd grown up here. And my father didn't speak to me for a year. So that's that, to kind of flesh that out. It wasn't that, I was this big rebel or we had, a lot of internal conflict. It was really just this breaking apart of this incredible relationship.
It almost sounds like it wasn't your choice to a large extent.
Oh, 100%.
It was out of your control.
It was out of my control during my life, during my lifetime. Because
it's interesting. I'm divorced. I have 4 kids. I don't know how to state that anymore because I have 3 living kids, 1 deceased child. And 2 of my children are alienated from me. My oldest daughter, who's now an LCSW, so she's a social worker, and we were very close for the first 14 years. And then the divorce happened. She kind of chose sides and never spoke to her again. And I've reached out to her dozens of times and just no response.
Wow.
And so, interesting because it's not really my choice, but I've had to make peace with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting parallel experience, in this flip-flop.
So let me ask you this. How did you deal with your grief? Because I think it's a really interesting question of how do professionals in mental health deal with something as powerful and primal as grief?
The most important thing for me along my grief journey with my father was going, of course, to my own therapy and getting EMDR. I had EMDR about that night when everything exploded to go from
it's
such
a traumatic
close
memory.
family. Yeah. And I think diving into my own growth, I think part of the way I dealt with grief all along is that I knew it had to be this inside job. I couldn't find something out here to fix it for me. And let me tell you, I tried.
Which is frustrating.
Through my 20s, I tried. And then finally in my 30s kind of came to this realization of like, oh my God, it's got to be an internal job. And so, with this latest grief, part of it, John, was talking about it to my partner. And thank God he's so there, and that I could just do that like ugly crying and just, be in it. And
so when you do the ugly cry with him, I'm assuming that you do not feel judged by him about that. Is that correct?
No. Yeah, he is awesome.
That's a key component. I believe it's, if you have someone that you can trust enough to show all your grief to, for them to witness that grief, I think is important, because part of it is, I think the emotion itself is overwhelming and powerful and really difficult and painful. And yet we really get stuck when we start to judge ourselves for feeling the emotions and thinking we shouldn't feel this, or we shouldn't feel it for this long, or we shouldn't be angry, or we shouldn't be this sad. And the other piece that I've realized in my own grief is that it's really important to work to radically accept this new reality, that the person you love is no longer here, no longer present, at least in their 5-layer meat sack anymore. I believe the energy is still present. It's just changed forms. And so I think also the other part of it is what we believe about the afterlife also enters into this. I really appreciate your context too about your relationship with your dad, because I think the relationship that you have with the person that passes away also plays a big role in your grief. So in other words, were you at peace with this relationship? Do you have any regrets? Were you alienated? Were you at odds? All that factors in.
Right. Yeah. And I think it does 100%. And I think part of what added to the grief, John, at the very end for me too, was my brother was there in Austin with him in the hospital, and he was basically just being kept alive at that point on machines.
Yeah.
And my brother, for some reason, decided to tell me, he said, Steph, I don't know why, but for the last 6 years, every time Dad called me, he asked about you. and told me to tell you he loved you, but I never did. He never did. He had never told me that.
Wow.
And only later, when I was really having feelings about it and confronted my brother again around this, he said, I didn't want to be in the middle. He needed to call you and tell you that. He needed to reach out. And so I get it.
Understandable.
But yeah. And I guess for me, that was part of the grief, is that knowing that Dad actually felt that way, I was like, I just want to tell him I love him. I just want to be able to say, Dad, I know. And I did know he loved me, but to be able to say that.
What are your beliefs about the afterlife or what happens after death in terms of continuing to communicate with him?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe, like you said, that energy goes on. Mm-hmm. And I know it. I feel like through those dreams, that was a part of it. I had a very bizarre situation happen truly right after he passed.
Tell me.
Yeah. It's giving me the chills already. I was sitting in my office, and my office that I was in is up high. So I had this big window, and I literally had a client sitting in front of me, and she was sitting in front of that picture window. And behind there is an alley. And I had never even noticed that there was this telephone pole in the middle of the alley. I just wouldn't have thought of it. All of a sudden, this huge, this is downtown Fort Collins, hawk. Like, I thought it was an owl at first. It was so huge. And it comes and it perches on that telephone pole, and it's just looking directly at me. And I'm like, the woman's doing EMDR, so her eyes are closed. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm really trying to focus, but that thing is there for like 5 minutes, does not move, and is just looking at me. And so I said, you're just a minute. And I literally had my phone, because I was using it for a counter, and I had to take a picture of it. I had to know, like, wow, this is real. And what's so interesting is the next day, I was like, okay, so as you know, this is the beginning of December. I'm like, I want to get Christmas decorations. I like to get personalized ones. So I go on to Etsy to look for something for my husband. And the first, this is just giving me the chills. The first ornament that pops up, and of course I bought this, was this huge hawk carved out of wood. And the words say, I will always be with you.
Wow.
I am not kidding.
So do you use hawks as a symbol for communication with your dad?
Now I do. Oh my gosh. You better believe it.
I think that's one of the ways to go, right? Is I choose to believe that there's certain ways that my son Brett is trying to communicate with me. And if I can share a story of my own,
I'd love to.
I have heard these stories almost every time somebody has a loved one that dies. But it was I think about 15 days after his death, and I was up really early in the morning, like 4 a.m, and I was having my coffee and eating my peanut butter toast, which is what I normally do. And so nobody's up. The house is dark. It's totally quiet. And I heard something, and I thought, oh, my daughter opened her bedroom door to let the dog out. And then I felt a bump on my chair, like the chair moved slightly. And I was like, oh, and I looked down, and there's no dog. And the dog's asleep in my daughter's room. And I'm like, that's not an earthquake. An earthquake doesn't just move one chair. And the dog wouldn't be big enough to move this chair. And so then my thought was like, oh, hi, Brett. What's up?
Yeah.
I hear you. I feel you. And it's interesting to me, because I don't think we can have confirmation on a lot of these beliefs, at least not yet. And I think it's one of the big ideas is choose the interpretation that serves you best. I have a couple clients with death anxiety, and they're really, really scared about their own death or death of loved ones. And I think part of it is getting them to choose to have some beliefs that bring them some ease and some calm about what happens after death. I mean, to the extent we believe that all we are is this 5-layer meat sack, and once we die, the light goes out and you're gone forever, is kind of a scary thought, which I choose not to believe because it doesn't serve me.
Yes. Yeah. And I am with you. And I will tell you, I had a situation happen when my daughter, who's now 35, was 4 years old, that changed my life forever. And I do write about that in my book as well, because it was so profound. She was 4 years old. My aunt, Gwen, had just gotten diagnosed with terminal cancer. She already had breast cancer for 5 years, and they went to go do this exploratory surgery, and it was just everywhere. It had just, she hadn't done chemo. She had tried to do all these holistic ways of dealing with it. And so it had just spread. And at that time, they literally were saying she's got probably 3 months. So I get this phone call, and I'm actually in the bathtub with a portaphone at the time. And we didn't have cell phones.
That was a while back.
Yeah,
then,
yeah. I mean, she's 35 now, right? So 31 years ago, I'm on the big portaphone, and I hang up, and I'm in the bathroom. I'm still in the bathtub, and I'm just crying. And my daughter, now really interesting, little Acacia, her name is Acacia, and Acacia is the Greek word for immortality. So the tree of life is the acacia tree.
Oh, is it really? That's the tree that giraffes eat too, yeah?
Yeah.
Acacia, sharp needles.
Yep. And these big green leaves. So she comes in and she sits on the tub, and she's like, "Why are you crying, Mama?" And I said, "Oh, sweetheart, Mama just doesn't want anyone to die." And she looks at me, and she's like, it was so interesting, just totally out of her character. She looks at me, she goes, "Well, Mama, we never die." And I said, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, someone said something to her, like, we weren't religious. We didn't talk about God or heaven, but I said, "Yeah, I know, sweetheart, people, we go to heaven." And she looks at me and she says, "Mom, there's no heaven." She said, "When I was in the sky with God, when I was a light," this is what she says, "when I was a light in the sky with God." And then she pauses and she says, "Do you remember your other mother, Dorothy?" Now here's, John, where it's like, I have no explanation for this. My other mother, as she phrased it, Dorothy, was my grandmother who died when I was 13. My other mother, Dorothy.
Wow, so you had a couple of traumas at 13.
Yeah, 13 was a big year.
Sorry about that.
No, yeah, it's all good. But interestingly, and Acacia didn't know her, because my grandfather married a year later, never met her. I didn't have any pictures of her. We didn't talk about her. Grandma Seal was who my grandfather had married, and that's who she knew.
Yeah.
And so she said, "Mom, your other mother, Dorothy, her light was in the sky with me. And so God put some of her light in me, and I got to come down and be your daughter."
Wow.
So riddle me that,
I think it makes me think of the movie Soul by Disney, the animated movie.
Yes.
I think that is pretty close to what I believe. There's some similarities there. And it's interesting that a cartoon really encapsulates my afterlife beliefs.
No, but I so get it. I saw that
Not
too.
Sure how shallow that is, but anyway. So let me ask you this. So thank you for sharing all that. I appreciate it. And one of your themes is the biggest challenge, the biggest hurt, the biggest trauma in your life is also the greatest treasure you have to share with the world. Tell me a little bit about that idea.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that has been true over and over again, because and you can think about this for you in your own life, and I think, the listeners, oftentimes it's those hard times that really break us open. I think of Elizabeth Lesser's book, Broken Open, and it's, difficult times that help us grow. And that truly was the case here. And, as I was saying, it wasn't until I was in my early 30s, I went to this healing school, the Sufi school, actually in San Francisco for a week. And while I was there, I met the presenter, on the way in, shook his hand. And he was one of those people, like, he's looking into your eyes, like he is looking into your soul, and I'm like, like kind of trying to pull my hand away as he's shaking it for a long time. And he's up on stage. There's only about 40 of us students there, but he's up on stage, and like a fourth of the way through his talk, he says, "Hey, you in the blue coat, I have a message for you." And I'm like looking around everywhere, and I look down, I'm like, "Oh shit, I'm the one in the blue coat." And he's like, and so he says, "What you need to hear is," and he says, "Blah, blah," I can't hear him. Like he says something, but I can't hear him. And you know how I was saying it like before we got on the air, that like when something amazing is going to happen, like there's this interesting inner resistance, like how we were not able to schedule our podcast together, or, things like that happen. Well, he says it again and I still can't hear him. And people are starting to laugh, and people are like, he's like, "My dear, obviously you have a lot of resistance to this message." It's like, what I'm trying to say is, and literally at that moment, all the air conditioning units in the place come on and nobody can hear him. So people are just laughing. And he's like, "Okay, come up here, like get up here." And when I finally go up and I sit on this little step beside the stage, he says, "My dear, what I am trying to tell you is stop trying."
Oh, yeah.
Stop.
That's a great message.
Trying, because you've been trying so hard to be perfect for your husband and your father. How he knew that, I have no idea.
Yeah.
It's like, stop trying. All the love, all the strength, all the wisdom, everything you're looking for is right there inside yourself.
Yeah. Is that the people-pleasing curse?
I don't even know if it was the people-pleasing curse. It was I'm trying to fill what doesn't feel good inside of me. So I'm going to keep doing the next best thing. I'm going to, keep putting myself through school. I'm going to keep going through whatever class and achieve this. Yeah. And if I only look good enough and have the right house and have the right car, I'm going to be happy.
Well, yeah, I think I tried to achieve my way out of depression when I was, 17. If I'm achieving all over the place, like how could I possibly be sad?
Well, and I'm curious for you, John. So how did you deal with that? How did you come to that?
Oh, I think I realized at 17 that we were fed a bullshit story by society that, we work hard, get good grades, get into a great college, get a good job, eventually get married, get promoted, make a lot of money, retire at 65, and then we'll be happy. And, I was someone that felt deeply, and, to be a young man in the man box, that's difficult, although I think most men are like that. In fact, there's research that supports that. And so I got into psychology pretty early in an effort to study more about emotions, and became an emotion geek, and really worked hard at facing my own demons, mostly emotional demons, anxiety, depression. I think there was some anger at the end of my marriage, and really went right after those, and ultimately became as authentic and transparent as I could, and just stepped out of that rat race hedonic treadmill mentality, realizing that it's about enjoying the journey. Happiness is about enjoying the journey, not so much about, getting to the destination or the goal or that next achievement, because we know that we'll adapt to that in a matter of minutes or weeks. And usually most men I talk to will get a huge, they get a promotion to senior VP, and then 5 seconds later, they're like, "Okay, what's next?" But they've spent 3 years trying to get to that title.
Right. And,
Is that the recipe for happiness? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. And I remember listening to a podcast with, and I don't listen to rap, so I didn't know the rap star, but I was fascinated because this rap star was sharing that his most depressed moment was when he got his 3rd platinum album. Because exactly what you're saying, he had set it up that I'm going to be happy. Finally, I'm going to be successful. I'm going to be happy. And the realization that didn't fix it, he plummeted. And so, and like you, John, I feel like that moment for me, there in San Francisco was such a catalyst of going like, okay, now it's this inside job, that the wounding then, partially, I feel like I'm a very effective clinician because I've been gutted. I felt it. I have been to a lot of those deep, dark places. And so the capacity to hold that and to be with that, then that becomes, like we were saying, that gift to the world. And I do believe that, from that moment, and there were several that continued to be like through that pain. I had someone in my family try to commit suicide 3 times, and very, very serious attempts. But from that, and that was 18 years ago, I said, I'm not going to keep working as a counselor in the school district. I went to grad school to be in private practice. And that moment, after this 3rd attempt and literally hitting my knees, just like, oh my God, life is so precious. What do we want to do? From that pain became this beautiful and fulfilling 17-year practice, which so many amazing things have sprung from in my life.
Yeah. And I really like the idea, which you mentioned earlier, which is basically, cracking open due to trauma or difficulty. There's an idea by a philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who said that what we really need for true kind of exponential growth is a radical shattering of our framework. And, I think difficulty and trauma does just that. And we know from research that one of the ways to move from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth is simply to ask, what am I supposed to learn from this? And so if you can reframe it as a learning opportunity, and I went through a really contentious divorce about 14, 15 years ago, and it was brutal and not by my choice. And, after a while, I learned to be grateful for it because it taught me excellent emotional management skills. It taught me how difficult it is for some people to go through divorce and how nasty and cantankerous it can be, but doesn't have to be. So I think anything like that, to the extent we can flip it, and sometimes there's some time involved there. It doesn't happen right away, but I think that's the goal. What do you think?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I got this really awesome journal for this year called The Artist of Life. And
I've heard that.
It's so cool, John. The first part of it is like you're looking back over 2023, and that's part of what you're looking at is like what worked, what didn't, what were the highlights and accomplishments, and what were the life lessons, so that you really have that opportunity to go back and go, wow, this thing was really hard, but maybe I found inner courage or inner strength I didn't know I had, or maybe I learned that I could really step into my voice and I wasn't going to be silent anymore, or whatever it is for each individual. And how important that is. I think that reflection is just key then in moving forward in our lives. And how can we keep, I love it. One of the questions too, the prompts is what habits are working and what habits aren't working.
That's a good question.
And then what do I want to start incorporating into my life? What new habits do I want to develop so that we're really moving forward? And, and I do think, I guess I want to circle back around to something that you said earlier, which was when you were talking about, the grief journey, how important it is to be with our feelings and be with whatever comes up. And I feel like that is an essential part of everything that we're talking about. Because when you're talking about how do we get the life lessons or how do we move forward, we got to feel it. And we might not be able to, like you said, get the life lesson when we're in the heart of the mess, so to speak. But to be able to know, like, okay, not necessarily, people don't always like that phrase, like, okay, this is happening for a reason. Because when you're in great pain, there's like, there's no freaking reason why this is happening, right? And that there is something essential that, I do feel like we're here to evolve and grow. And not always are the lessons comfortable. Our growth edge is rarely comfortable.
No, not at all. And that's why I think we need the pain in many regards, because it forces us to grow. Because if we're comfortable, it's too easy to want to remain comfortable and not grow. And I think, a lot of people do that. I think that there's this cycle in relationships, friendships, where, we love someone and we get hurt, which is inevitable. And then we close up and wall off. And then the trick is to, as soon as you can, to open back up again to the possibility of loving, to repair. And that cycle is just repeated ad nauseum throughout your life. And I see so many people that just stay stuck in that walled off position because like, fuck it, I got hurt. I'm not doing that again. And I get that for a period of time. I think the challenge is not to do it permanently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at some point, what feels like protection becomes a prison.
Mm-hmm.
And so
then you're alone and disconnected, which is not a way to happiness.
Right. I mean, we're all interconnected beings. And I love, and to me, it's not just a thought, it's the reality that love is unlimited. It's not like we have this finite supply. And so we only get to experience it in this little increment. So if this relationship failed, I'm sorry, that was your quotient of love. You're done.
Uh-huh.
I just don't believe that. And
so on that note, do you believe in a soulmate? Like, is there one person that you're supposed to fall in love with? And if you don't meet that person, you're screwed?
No, I don't. I believe that we have soul mates, plural. I remember the late, great Wayne Dyer would talk about that we had soul contracts with people. And, Marianne Williamson would say, back in her book, The Return to Love, I mean, this is, 30 years ago too. Yeah. I'm dating myself here, but, that we're with people for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And I truly believe that. So, I think the calling of our soul is to love, period. And so we experience that in so many different ways. But in that too, and I agree, but that growth and evolution, I think, is loving ourselves. That there's something that as we
and
do
learning
that,
to love others.
Yeah.
Loving self. Well, I would say it's a little bit harder for most.
For sure.
I lost my train of thought there.
Well, and really quickly to your point on it's really hard to love ourselves. I think it's so important because people say things like, "Oh, just love yourself, be your own best friend," and it's like, as you and I both know, it's not easy, and it's not something you just flip a switch and like, "Oh, I'm all in love with me." So it takes like cultivating that relationship with you. It literally is like building a muscle. And for me, John, the biggest way to do that is learning how to show up for ourselves. And because we've let ourselves down, I mean, you can think, how many times did I say I'm going to do this diet and do this exercise routine? I'm going to start meditating, and then we don't. And so to start cultivating little daily habits, things that you're accountable to no one but you for. And honestly, one of the things that my clients love and I get like really cool feedback about is I have them do a wall calendar that they can see so that when they show up for themselves, so they're showing up for a relationship with them, which is you keep your promise to you. You say, okay, in the morning, I'm going to do my gratitudes. I'm going to go for a walk. I mean, it doesn't have to be unreasonable things you want to do. But then at the end of the day, instead of crossing that day out, you put a heart on it.
Oh, I like it.
And so my clients come back and they're like, oh my God, it's so cool to look back on this month. And there's all these hearts there. I literally even have a client who color codes her hearts because she's like, if I went swimming that day, they're blue. If I went hiking that day, they're green. But she's like, it feels so good because I can see myself building that relationship with me.
Yeah, I love that because I think, one of the themes that I've been talking about with clients probably last year was self-care. And, how so many of us are on this unsustainable treadmill of trying to please and meet the needs of everybody else around us. And we completely neglect our own needs and the boundaries that we need and the self-love. And it's just not a sustainable model. You're going to get tapped out, exhausted, stressed, burned out, sick. Inflammation is going to, run rampant in your body. There's all sorts of problems with it. But I think most of us were taught growing up that it's selfish to put yourself first. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, absolutely. I feel like everyone I speak to and I say, okay, part of your job is to work on you being a priority in your own life. You see the recoil because we all were taught that. I remember when, I was an angsty teenager and my mom would say, instead of worrying about yourself, go up. We literally had a nursing home that was up the hill from our house. And she's like, go there. And, and I would read for blind people, like get out of your own head, do something for somebody else. And of course,
that is a good strategy.
It's a good strategy. And
but you don't want to overgeneralize that.
Right. When all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's not okay for me to take care of myself. Instead, if I take care of someone else, then I'm okay. And again, I mean, of course, we want to contribute that. And that's why I say your period healing period matters, period. Because as we heal, we actually do become clearer conduits for more love and joy and healing to come into the world. We can actually serve so much better because we really we've got this reservoir from which to serve from.
So let me ask you this. This is a little bit of a detour, but was there a point in your life so do you have a PhD or
No.
master's?
Master's.
Was your master's, how science-based was it?
It was clinical psychology.
So how scientific or data-driven were you early on?
Oh,
versus spiritual?
Oh, I think actually even then I was spiritual, to be honest.
Okay. I'm just curious because I was, at getting a PhD at UC Berkeley, it's incredibly scientifically backed, data-driven, empirical research up the wazoo. And, I came out of there really believing that science was the only lens through which you could view reality. And it took me some undoing, some unlearning to realize that science is a great lens, a great framework, but it can't explain everything. And it's slow to catch up to a lot of truths. And it's interesting to me because I think traditionally for the last 100 years, scientists, MDs have had a hard time speaking about their spiritual piece because there was such this schism between science and spirituality. And it's interesting to me to see in the last, 20 years that's kind of healing.
Absolutely. I see that too. And I remember being really excited about that, psychology and spirituality merging and actually backing up one another. And so I find that really fascinating. I guess, even though, I would say like one of the highlights in the last 6 years was getting to go and be a part of a training group at Stanford University with one of my old gurus, my hero, David Burns, not the lead singer of Talking Heads, but
yes,
one of the fathers of cognitive behavioral psychology. Yeah. And I'd had him on my show a few times.
Wasn't that the Feeling Good handbook?
Yep. Feeling Good.
One of the best-selling books of all time, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And his book, Feeling Good Together, literally saved my brother and sister-in-law's marriage. So I had these really deep connections to him. He'd been on the show a few times and then invited me out to Stanford, where I got to be a part of his podcast and then also be a part of this super cool, intense training group. And, and that was my orientation for my thesis and in grad school was around CBT. I really believe in it. But even then, being with him, I felt like things that I learned in that, I have to tell you, the one thing that I always take away from that experience was his saying to this whole group, and it was intense, John. I mean, it was like I was there with like 42 other psychologists, and you're given a case and you present it, you give your diagnosis, and then what you would do CBT wise to address it. Very intense. And then David, would grade you literally out loud in front of the class. So
ouch.
It was really intense. And I thought it was really beautiful. But one of the things he said is, we all, and he used this term, which I thought was great, we all relapse every day. You're going to relapse into whatever those limiting beliefs are, whatever those, wounds may be. It's how quickly you get yourself out of that. And I think when I first started as a therapist, 17 years ago, I would have taken everything he said as gospel. And that's all that I focused on was And I was the clinician that I was much more serious, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something really beautiful for me in his humanness. Not that he was necessarily spiritual, but that he really gave people permission, like, you're going to be who you are. Life is messy. And so what we have to do is learn these ways to get out of it. And I think what I've done since then is really myself, as I've learned things from Bruce Lipton or Joe Dispenza or, some of these different people. I had Bruce on my show, and being able to merge science and spirituality and psychology, like, that's the trifecta, man. That's
yeah. Well, and Joe's bringing in quantum physics, and that's, which I love as well. But going back to Burns, I love Burns' work. I think CBT is an incredibly powerful framework, and I was in love with it coming out of Cal, because Cal was all about thinking. There was very little about emotion there. However, I also believe strongly with Antonio Damasio, the neuroresearcher, who says we are not thinking beings who feel; we are feeling beings that think. Understating the primacy of emotion. And cognitive behavioral therapy, in my opinion, downplays the role of emotion.
It does. I mean, it can be a very, in a way, safe framework. If you remember that simple triangle from Cognitive Behavioral Therapy 101, which is, our thoughts connect to our feelings, connect to our actions, and then that triangle repeats itself. Well, it doesn't emphasize feelings very much. Our thoughts are like what's driving everything.
Thoughts are what drive emotion always.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, maybe that's an overstatement, but that was kind of my understanding. And I think it can go both ways. And there's sometimes when thoughts don't drive emotions, when emotions just are.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was really important work. So listen, I'm aware of time, and I know we have to wrap up now. So just do me a favor and tell us a little bit about your movie and your latest book, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I've been really thrilled, John, because the end of December, my film, which has been on Plex Network on the More You channel for a year, was also picked up by Neil Donald Walsh and Steve Farrell's organization called Humanities Team.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I mean, it's such an honor to be on that platform. So now I'm on Humanities Stream Plus, that film is. And that film truly is about so much of what we talked about. It's about raising consciousness. It's about how, as we heal, we do become like the pebble in the pond. And those concentric circles of healing come out from us. So
I like pardon me for interrupting. I like the idea of Ted Lasso, where Ted, I don't know if you're familiar with the show, but in the opening, in the intro, he's sitting in the bleachers, and the bleachers around him change colors. The seats change colors. And the idea there behind the show is that by being himself, by being authentic, he changes people around him simply by being him. And I love that idea. I think it's the same as what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really is. And that kind of lends into my book, Becoming Fierce. And people will say, well, what does fierce mean? Well, fierce is literally that fiery energy. It's not being aggressive or mean. It's literally about being that authentic light, that spark that is us, and being in fuller expression in the world. So you've got a fire theme going through all your material. Are you a fire type in Ayurvedic medicine? I am. That's interesting.
Just a guess.
I'm a pitta. Yeah. Mega pitta.
I am also.
Oh, are you? Yeah. I can tell. And I would say, my whole brand around the spark comes from what I truly believe is that spark that is our essence. That is the part that's still alive in your son and my dad. It's that part of us that cannot be extinguished. And sometimes it feels like it gets covered up with situations or circumstances. And then our work is, how do we excavate it? Because it is always there. And when we let that part of us shine, that's why I say, together we can ignite the world. I mean, we illuminate the world with those sparks.
Yeah. And I love the idea of, raising consciousness around us. I think it's never been more needed than now.
Yeah. The essential time is
you do.
now. Thank you. Thank you, John.
And thank you for being on the show. And briefly, where can they find your latest book?
So it's available Barnes and Noble, Amazon, any bookstore.
Okay.
Yeah, and they can find out any information about events or books or the film at my website, which is stephaniejames.world.
And there will be a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link to the preview of the film.
Oh, cool. Wonderful. Thank you, John.
So thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. I'm glad we finally got this scheduled and got it knocked out. It was a true pleasure.
It was for me as well. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of The Evolved Caveman. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, please feel free to like, rate, review, and share. If you didn't like it, you don't have to do a damn thing. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you like what you've heard, support us by subscribing, leaving reviews, and sharing the podcast with friends and colleagues. For the latest, most powerful tools to connect with like-minded men, join the Facebook group at The Evolved Caveman. Follow Dr. John on Instagram at The Evolved Caveman, all one word, or join the email list by visiting guidetoself.com.